Hi, I'm Greg Corombos. My guest at this time is China expert Gordon G. Chang. You can find him on Twitter at Gordon G. Chang, and he's also the author of numerous books, including The Coming Collapse of China. We want to get his reaction today to strong actions the Chinese are taking related to Hong Kong, while, of course, the United States and much of the world remain focused on the coronavirus, which obviously has Chinese ties as well, since it originated in Wuhan. And Gordon, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Greg.
Well, Gordon, we've already seen some major developments with respect to Hong Kong this week. First of all, and I hope you can provide a little bit of context for this, there were images from earlier in the week where lawmakers of some body in Hong Kong were being literally dragged out by security, apparently in an attempt to install a presiding officer or a chairman more favorable to the wishes of the Chinese Communist Party. And now, of course, we have the news being reported by the Associated Press and others that China's ceremonial parliament, the National People's Congress, is going to deliberate what's being called national security legislation designed to establish and improve the legal system and enforce mechanisms for the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region to safeguard national security, which basically means they're not going to rely on the legislative body in Hong Kong now to do what they want done, changing course now after so much difficulty getting what they wanted to get passed last year. So what's your reaction to this? How significant is what we're seeing in Hong Kong this week?
Well, this week really is the culmination of about 2 months of actions on the part of Beijing to tighten down on Hong Kong. First, they started in Beijing to chip away at the legal basis of autonomy of Hong Kong under the one country, two systems formula. There was the arrest of 15 senior pro-democracy figures. They've been moving against the district councils, which the pro-democracy forces captured in the November election last year. And the Hong Kong police have been acting much more thuggishly, if that were possible. So what we have seen this week, basically really strong action to take control of the House Committee of the Legislative Council. That's what you were referring to with regard to the legislators being carried away. Also, this is Article 23 legislation that Beijing will push in the National People's Congress because they couldn't get it through the Legislative Council in Hong Kong. So that's the second thing you referred to.
And so let's get to the reaction here now, Gordon. This clip that we're about to hear is from a man named Dennis Kwok. He is a lawyer and legislator in Hong Kong, and he is not mincing words at all here. Listen to this.
I just want to say to the international community that this is the end of Hong Kong. This is the end of one country, two system. Make no mistake about it, that Beijing, the Central People's Government, has completely breached its promise to the Hong Kong people, a promise that was enshrined in the Sino-British Joint Declaration and the Basic Law. And they are now completely walking back on their obligation owed to the Hong Kong people. This is it. Make no mistake about it. And I foresee that the international status of Hong Kong as a city, the international city, will be gone very soon.
So he says this is the end of Hong Kong. Is that being overdramatic, or is he just saying it straight here? China's decided that this policy that was supposed to unfold over a number of decades is now just being crammed into the immediate future.
Well, there will be Hong Kong after Beijing's push to enact Article 23 legislation, but it's not going to be the Hong Kong that we all know. And what he's referring to is that Beijing is taking full control of the territory instead of letting the one country, two systems formula continue on until 2047, which is a scheduled end. The concern here is that as Beijing takes full control, Hong Kong will no longer be the global financial center that it has been, largely because you can't have one unless you have the rule of law. And of course, where China rules, there is no rule of law.
So what's the impact as more and more Chinese control happens here? And given the way they're setting this up now, it almost seems inevitable that it will happen. So what happens to Hong Kong as an economic hub, as an outpost of freedom in China?
I think what we'll see is there's going to be a migration of business out of Hong Kong. So some of it will go, for instance, to Singapore, which has traditionally been a rival to Hong Kong. Some will go to Tokyo, maybe a little bit of it to Taipei. But Hong Kong will remain as a financial center, but perhaps only for China itself. In other words, it'll become just like Shanghai. Hong Kong was able to withstand the challenge from Shanghai because Shanghai didn't have an independent judiciary, didn't have the rule of law, all of those things that you need for a vibrant financial center. Hong Kong's going to lose that, which means it could become just another Chinese city, as they say in Hong Kong.
Is there any coincidence to the timing with the rest of the world focused on the virus right now?
I actually don't think so. Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, has always been a sponsor of tough policies on Hong Kong. I think he saw an opportunity with the world distracted by coronavirus. So he started moving on the territory about a couple months ago. And I think that really was a time when we were focused more on the diseases in our country than we were on what China was doing. With Xi Jinping, there are very few coincidences, but we really don't know what he's thinking many of the times. We just have to try to infer from what he's been doing. So I think that there really was an attempt to do something while the world was distracted.
What are we in a position to do that would have any impact here?
One thing that we should do is we should withdraw the exemptions that are currently in place for Hong Kong. We have sanctions on China. Those sanctions don't apply to Hong Kong because we believe that it was governed autonomously. But now with Beijing taking full control of the territory and the financial center, I think that we should apply those sanctions to Hong Kong itself. And that's what Hong Kong protesters want. They want us to do that because they understand that is going to be effective, at least in some part of dealing with China.
What's going to happen to the protesters that the regime knows about?
I think we're going to see much bigger protests. Remember, this Article 23 legislation that we're talking about wasn't enacted, largely because there have been large demonstrations going back 2 decades against it. And so I think that probably will turn out the crowds. I also think that we are going to see a summer of discontent, and many of these demonstrations are going to be violent. The Chinese could then introduce their troops into Hong Kong, and then it would be open warfare.
We're talking with Gordon Chang, China expert. You can find him on Twitter at Gordon G. Chang. And Gordon, given the circumstances of the past year or so, you would think China would be one of the great villains on the world stage. Their deception about the transmissibility and what they did in efforts to stop the virus and just simply not telling the truth about it for weeks on end, and their brutal crackdown on the demonstrators in Hong Kong. Instead, they're being defended roundly. The World Health Organization, of course, is sticking up for China at every turn. The press in this country is defending China, perhaps simply because our president is blaming China for the virus. You also have Democrats defending China. You've even got Senator Kamala Harris proposing legislation to crack down on people even mentioning it as a Chinese virus. How did we get to the point where China is the victim here in the eyes of so many people?
Well, I do think a large part of it is partisan politics. But I should remind people who would normally just reflexively oppose anything that President Trump is doing, is that at least until noon on January 20 of next year, he's the only person who can defend us against a common enemy that every day attacks us. And our republic is at risk. This is an existential struggle. And so it's, I think, incumbent on Democrats and others to rally behind the president. I think it's incumbent on the president to do things which would make it easy for people to oppose China. So there's obligations on both sides. But we Americans can lose our republic. And so we've got to stop this partisan haggling.
As our exit question here, Gordon, we've talked about this before, depending on how things unfold in Hong Kong, could that be a template for what China might want to do in Taiwan? Just in the past few days, the Chinese said it's an inevitability that Taiwan will be eventually folded into mainland China. The Taiwanese pushing back hard on that. So what do you make of that back and forth this week?
Basically, you have Beijing. It's not only threatening an invasion of Taiwan, they've actually also had engaged in a series of provocative incidents in the South China Sea and East China Sea against not only Taiwan, but also Japan, the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia. You had a Chinese diplomat float the idea that Kazakhstan should be absorbed into the People's Republic of China. Chinese diplomats have been pretty undiplomatic recently, and they call it wolf warrior diplomacy. We've got to be very concerned that Beijing could lash out on a country or maybe many countries, and this could really drag the world into the next great conflict.
Sobering analysis, but important for us to keep an eye on. Gordon, thank you very much for your time today. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Greg.
China expert Gordon Chang. You can find him on Twitter at Gordon G. Chang, and his book, The Coming Collapse of China, is available, I'm sure, at Amazon and many other places as well. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.